Good afternoon to our audience in Guyana and North America, and good evening to those joining us in the UK. On behalf of Moray House Trust, welcome to our panel and discussion about Guyana's Low Carbon Development Strategy 2030. For those joining us for the first time tonight, Moray House Trust is a private, non-partisan, non-profit based in Georgetown and dedicated to promoting Guyanese culture and public discourse. My name is Isabel de Caries. I'm the chair of trustees at Moray House Trust. A warm Guyanese welcome to our regulars. Please note that this event is being live streamed via Facebook. If you are on Zoom and would prefer not to be visible, please turn off your video, usually a camera icon on the bottom left of the Zoom screen. Please keep your setting to mute while the panel is speaking. We will start with a brief presentation from each panelist. There's a short interlude where members of the panel can question each other. After this, there will be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. Please keep your questions brief. Events on the international stage today have underlined the fragility of our rules-based international order and our democracies. In Guyana, we place great emphasis on the functioning of our electoral system, engaging the health of our democracy. And so should we, given recent events here. But free and fair elections are not the sole indice. There are many others, including an independent media, robust public institutions, and a vibrant public discourse. Recently in Guyana, there have been, to put it politely, questions as to the purpose of the panels organized by Moray House Trust. Some view the panels as anti-government. Others view them as inherently partisan. It's worthwhile, therefore, repeating why we host these panels and what we aim to achieve. The point of a Moray House Trust panel is threefold: to inform the public and thereby raise the level of public discourse, to expose ideas, propositions, proposals to scrutiny and debate, and to provide a forum for us to debate and disagree amicably, civilly, and according to certain conventions and norms. There can be no sacred propositions or policies in a democratic society. All are fair game for scrutiny and debate. At a time in Guyana when large-scale projects with eye-watering budgets and a flurry of consequential public policies are being proposed, it is, in our view, essential for these projects and policies to be discussed and debated publicly. 10 years ago, in a poetry workshop at Moray House Trust, Ian MacDonald explained that Martin Carter never felt that a poem was finished or complete. As Stanley Graves recalled to Ian, Martin felt that all of his poems were fragments of the best poem that would never be written. So it is with a panel. A panel is an imperfect fragment of public discourse, a tiny act of democracy, if you like. A panel is never perfect, never perfectly pitched or perfectly balanced, with all perspectives represented and articulated. It should strive for this, but in the end, it is an attempt, a perpetual work in progress, an honorable failure, a small contribution to a conversation that will never cease. 7 years ago, in September 2015, Moray House Trust hosted our first panel. The topic was the sugar industry in Guyana. As with this evening, there were 4 presentations. Prior to the event, there were pointed suggestions from the corridors of power that the panel was premature. Possibly as a consequence, there was a poor turnout, though a minister and several union members attended. What was striking about the panel was how convincing a case could be made for and against the continuation of the sugar industry. First, a historian showed how the industry had overcome huge challenges in its past. Next, an economist provided a sober assessment of risk and debt. An industry expert charted the loss of access to traditional markets and pointed to opportunities closer to home. The former chair of Gaisuco explained how, with improved yields and new approaches such as cogeneration, a resurrection of the industry was possible. A professor in the audience remarked afterwards that she was swayed equally by each new argument. There were points where the panel converged, for example, on the vital importance of yields, and points where it diverged as to whether the industry had a viable future. What the panel did was put paid to easy certainties at either end of the spectrum. The prospects for sugar looked a lot less simple than they had at the start of the evening. As with that first panel, so with the dozens that have followed. In a nutshell, that is the purpose of these panels: to inform, to question, and to debate, all vital roles in a democratic society. It's a particular pleasure to have Florence Alexi LaRose as our moderator tonight. With over 15 years in the development field, Florence, a native of Santa Rosa village, Maruca, in Region 1, and founder of Marwan Consultancy, is no stranger to the importance of environmental harmonization. Having spent a decade working directly with Indigenous communities across Guyana as a project officer within the Ministry of Amerindian Affairs, and having contributed to the development of several socio-economic programs and projects within the ministry, Florence believes that it is important that everyone is aware of our resources and how they can be sustainably utilized, not only to provide a comfortable livelihood for the present generation, but also to continue to build a foundation for future generations. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Alexi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Good afternoon, good evening, good night for some of you. I'm so happy that you're able to join this evening's proceeding and the Moray House's Trust second in a series of discussion. And my name, as Isabel would have said, is Florence Alexi LaRose, and today we will be discussing Guyana's LCDS 2030 perspectives. Now, the persons that we have on panel today to give their perspectives are, I should say, heavyweights in their field. These individuals would have dedicated a number of years in charting the course, in contributing to the development of plans, in paving the way for issues that would definitely contribute to the LCDS 2030, which is a document that was built on the original LCDS document, which started in 2008. So what is going to happen this afternoon is I am going to give the panelists will each have 10 minutes to do their presentation. And if it is that they're going over a little too much, then I will have to ask you to wrap up. You, the audience, will have an opportunity to ask questions. The panelists will have an opportunity to make comments on each other's presentation or ask questions of each other. So it should be a really exciting learning opportunity for all of us this afternoon. And with no further ado, I wish to present the first panelist to you. As a matter of fact, I think it would be unfair for me not to tell you who they all are before I present the first speaker to you. Our panel this afternoon consists of Ms. Pradeepa Bholanath, Mr. Curtis Bernard, Aisha Williams, Mr. Thomas Singh. So our first speaker, Ms. Pradeepa Bholanath, is an environmental economist who is currently with the Ministry of Natural Resources in Guyana. She previously worked as program coordinator for the 11th European Development Fund at the CARICOM Secretariat, and as head of the planning development at the Guyana Forestry Commission. If you've been around anything LCDS or anything forestry related, anything EU flag, you know this name, Pradeepa Bholanath. It would be a name that would constantly come up because she's one of the persons who would be out there trying to share the knowledge, trying to get the audience involved, trying to make sure that everyone is on board and understand what is happening and where we are heading in whatever direction it is that she would have been representing. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Pradeepa Bholanath. Pradeepa.
Thank you very much, Alexi, for that introduction and your kind words as well, and Isabel as well for the overview and the context of our session here this afternoon. I'm joined today by Ms. Vanessa Ben. Vanessa is leading our stakeholder engagement exercise for the low carbon development strategy, and perhaps she can make her inputs in the discussion session of our panels 2 hours that we have this afternoon. So allow me, if I could, to share my screen. And I have a few slides prepared to give you a brief overview of LCDS 2030. So I hope you can see the slides in front of you. I should start off by saying that this is a draft document and is currently in the process of stakeholder engagement. We've had the first multi-stakeholder steering committee for this phase of the LCDS last Monday, and it is with a lot of anticipation now that we take forward the stakeholder engagement exercises. And we see this as one of those stakeholder engagement sessions where we can get a broad base of feedback on the document, where it could be improved, where you see there could be additional synergies, perhaps shortcomings in the way that we've addressed some of the sections. We are open to, the aspects of your feedback and how you see this as positioning Guyana in the next phase of our development. So allow me to go through just a brief overview as to what the LCDS is about. It outlines an approach and action that Guyana as a nation can take to develop and grow in an inclusive way and in a non-polluting low-carbon environment. It also outlines how the ecosystem services are to be used as part of this process. And it links this to the global economy and within the context of payment for ecosystem services. Now, it's going to be very important as we look ahead as to what is going to come up as far as 2030, and to look to see what we can do to take those steps forward. But first, we would have to ensure that we know the path which would have led us to the point where we're at right now. And a lot of that, as Florence would have mentioned, really started from the first LCDS. In LCDS 2009, which was officially launched in 2010, this really was nested under the Guyana-Norway agreement, which saw a total of approximately 212 million US being disbursed as part of the payment for performance for that period of the first LCDS, 2010 to 2020. Within the context of that endeavor, we were able to have a lot of programs advanced, some of which you see in the screen. I'll just go through this really rapidly. There was a lot of support for micro and small enterprise. There was a lot of support for Amerindian Development Fund, which saw 180 communities and villages being able to benefit. The Konya Canal was rehabilitated. The Amerindian land titling program was also advanced. The ICT access and e-services for hinterland poor and remote communities was also advanced, and that is currently ongoing. Solar power, the first utility scale solar power is being developed. And this is an ongoing project with resources from that initial 212 million under the Guyana-Norway agreement. Now, I say all of this to give you context as to the continuum of efforts across various governments. So in 2010 to 2015, the government then would have entered into the Guyana-Norway agreement and a lot of activities would have started. All of that work was taken forward into that second phase, where EITI was advanced, EU-FLECT was advanced. EITI is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. EU-FLECT is the European Union Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Program. And these programs were taken forward over that decade of continuous and unbroken work in terms of seeing the kinds of technical activities advance and also the kinds of negotiations at the level of the UN also advance to move us through the phases which you see in front of the screen here. I show this slide to make the point that what we've started now to do in LCDS 2030 really builds from everything which would have started under the first LCDS, all of the programmatic work which would have been embodied under that, the technical endeavors that would have taken place, including EITI and EU-FLECT, the work under the GSDS, and now we're on the phase one where we have LCDS 2030, potentially positioning our entry into the voluntary carbon market. I'll discuss more on the modalities of this in a few of the upcoming slides, but just to pinpoint that phase one is where we're at right now in terms of making this step towards building on LCDS, the first LCDS, and making our way towards 2030, towards this new realm of low carbon development. So as a premise to what the LCDS 2030 really seeks to do, it's important to really keep that in mind, the journey which would have led us to the point where we're at right now, for the main reason that a lot of the initiatives which are being advanced on the LCDS 2030 really uses as a takeoff point everything that would have been advanced under the first LCDS, the programmatic areas which would have been advanced over that time as well, and also including the developments with the GSDS and the work that would have taken place over the last 18 months or so, which I'll share with you, that are more oriented towards engaging in the voluntary carbon market. And I'll share more on this in a few of the upcoming slides. LCDS 2030 is geared towards four main objectives. The first has to do with creating new incentives for a low carbon economy. And it is within this objective that we see a lot of continuation of the program of work already started. I'll discuss a bit on the details of these in the upcoming slides. On the top right-hand button, you see that adaptation-oriented element as the objective number 2 of LCDS 2030, focusing on things like climate-resilient agriculture, coastal infrastructure, mangroves. The third objective of LCDS 2030 seeks to stimulate future growth through clean energy and low carbon development. And within LCDS 2030, there is an energy mix that is taking us forward to 2041 that shows the integration of current projects as well as projects that will come on board to decarbonize the economy as well as to continue to meet increasing demand for energy needs. And this as well, I'll take a deeper dive into this in the upcoming slide. On the fourth objective, that bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you see the objective as being aligning with global climate and biodiversity goals. Everything we do within the LCDS is focused on meeting the requirements of the SDGs, the Conventional Biological Diversity Commitments, the UNFCCC commitments, in a way that ensure that whilst we're pursuing those targets, for example, SDG 13 and SDG 15, Climate Action and Life on Land, and Decent Work, SDG 8, and as we're pursuing all of the commitments we've made on the conventional biological diversity, including the IG targets, that these are not done in parallel or on the periphery or in isolation of what LCDS 2030 seeks to do. What LCDS 2030 is positioning itself as is as the vehicle to take all of this forward in a way that would allow for a synergistic approach to meeting the global commitments, as well as to meeting the low carbon strategy program as outlined in LCDS 2030. So it's the vehicle for taking this forward in terms of the commitments that have been made. Now going into the first objective, and there are three sub-areas under the first objective: sustainable forestry and low impact mining, forest climate service, and other ecosystem services, including biodiversity and watershed management. And I know my colleagues on the call, Aisha and Curtis, may give reflections on both integrated water management as well as biodiversity. LCDS 2030 expands on the manner in which the first LCDS dealt with biodiversity and watershed management in a way that now includes not only the environmental aspect, but governance issue, management issues, looking at ways in which the IG targets that we have committed to could be further advanced. So it has elaborated on these in a way that allows for a more integrated approach. Some see the first LCDS as being more carbon-centric, being more towards one surface of the ecosystem. LCDS 2030 expands this in a very significant way. On the first tab of sustainable forestry and low impact mining, this perhaps is the clearest example of where there is that clear continuation of a program of work that started back in 2010, perhaps even years before that, but certainly that continued unhindered over the course of the last 10 years. And if we can take EU FLEGT as one of those examples, the European Union Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Program, This was the decision to enter into negotiation was actually made in March of 2012. Negotiations ensued to the point of 2015 and continued. In 2018, the VPA was initialed by Minister Trotman, who was involved in that milestone moment that shaped the way now for that next step, which LCDS 2030 is taking forward, which is readiness to issue the first license on the EU FLEGT. So these programs really have seen now close to 12 years of continuous work in taking them now to where LCDS 2030 will end, which will be towards, at each of the programs we've identified, that point in time of delivery of whatever the program is geared towards, if it's certification, if it is EU FLEGT, if it's EITI. So there's a whole lot more on each of these within the LCDS, but time won't permit me to go into the details of each one of them. But I think now it's good to see how this is positioned in terms of the Forest Climate Service as a whole. Now, back in 2010, when the Guyana-Norway Agreement was entered into, a lot of questions were raised. I know some of my colleagues here on the call raised these questions with the Norwegians and the government of Guyana at that time, was why couldn't this payment be more along the modalities as a payment for service? Because it is a service that is being bought, the service of carbon storage within the forest. And why was it more like a grant loan sort of mechanism that Guyana-Norway Agreement was oriented towards? And the simple answer is that market-based umbrella was not available at the time for where Guyana's forest is positioned. Now, this all changed about 18 months ago when the Architecture for REDD transaction came up with a standard called TREES version 2. So TREES stand for the REDD Plus Environmental Excellence Standard that really recognizes this first button of conserve that you see here on the screen. For those of us who are au fait with the world of REDD Plus and the negotiations at the level of the UNFCCC, you will know that within the UN umbrella, they recognize REDD Plus in a way that looks both at replacing forests which would have been lost, as well as conserving forests that would have been kept intact for years, decades, and centuries of concerted effort by governments and communities. There never was a recognition of value for the conserve aspect in the marketplace. We have seen a lot of examples in the case of Brazil, in the case of countries in Africa, in Asia, where a lot of inclusion in the clean development mechanism recognize replanted forests. You take forests down and you replant it, and then you have a space within this umbrella. There was never that space for a global recognition of value in this conserve tab. This all changed about 18 months ago when the Architecture for REDD transaction really developed a standard that gives the kind of recognition to what you see in front of you here on the screen, which is recognition for countries and the value of those ecosystems. And for countries that would have kept its deforestation rate low and flat, and compared to the international average, significantly lower. So that blue bar is the global average, the green bar is where Guyana sits. So you can see this.
Excuse me, you have 2 minutes more so we can start wrapping up.
Sure,
no problem. I know your presentation is riveting.
Great, okay, no problem. I'll try to make it as brief as I can. This slide really shows this positioning that we hold within Guyana in terms of maintaining low deforestation rates. And this really is connected to that tab of conserving forests, and therefore what is offered under the ART3 standard in recognizing that value, that conserved value of 19.6 gigatons of of carbon really has allowed for now that value to be recognized in a way that it is a tradable commodity and a fungible pool of carbon credits. And these are all connected to what the LCDS 2030 really could go towards implementing, and the programs that have been outlined for implementation. Now, in the last 2 minutes, let me just share with you a bit of the other aspects of LCDS 2030, focusing on the energy, and this could be an entire conversation by itself, but I think it's it's important to note that an important part of that bottom left-hand tablet you see on stimulating future growth, an energy balance that has clean and renewable energy in the mix that's been outlined in LCDS 2030 really is essential for realizing that goal. Within LCDS 2030, Guyana has outlined one of the most ambitious plans to decouple economic growth and greenhouse gas emissions in a way that allow for increasing demand to be able to be met by solar, wind, natural gas, and hydropower. And the projects that are oriented towards realizing these are detailed within the LCDS. And I'm sure by themselves would be or could be subject to independent sessions as this one on discussing the modalities and how those are going to be structured moving forward. In a similar way, the greenhouse gas emissions from the clean and renewable energy sources as outlined in that previous graph is one that is low and that is flat, even with increasing energy demands because of the mix that as has been outlined in LCDS 2030. Within LCDS as well, we've outlined that component on adaptation, and the aspects that you see on the top right-hand side of your screen focus heavily on climate resilient agriculture. We also outline coastal infrastructure and mangroves. Clean and renewable energy, I touched on that, but it's important to recognize that we see this as a core part of stimulating future low carbon growth and the modalities which have been outlined for taking that forward. Essential within the context of LCDS 2030 is recognizing the important role that all landowners and managers have to play within this process. So we have protected areas, we have state lands, we have state forests, we have Amerindian lands. And each of these areas, the role and the modalities of involvement have been also outlined in LCDS 2030. And some of this I share here with you on the screen. I'll go through these other parts really quickly, and I invite you to take a deeper look at the LCDS in terms of what is provided both for health and for education, in an integral way of outlining what is needed for health and education and for these sectors as we move towards a low carbon economy. The LCDS, therefore, is not an environmental mandate or is not an outline of projects that one seeks to implement to take us down a low carbon pathway. It's a development strategy that allows for the buildup of capacity and resources and capability over the last 10 years for all of that to be centered now towards a low carbon strategy to 2030. And the means of implementing this is through the voluntary carbon market that would see the designated and dedicated resources coming from this process to fund health requirements, education, environmental aspects, energy needs in a way that to make it independent of any kind of outside influence needing loans or grants or in an excessive way. So I think it's going to be an interesting opportunity for us to see, how the next 6 months, I didn't mention this earlier, but I think it's a good way to close, that within the next 6 months, we would see the completion of our audit process to enter into the voluntary carbon market. And that would shape a lot of what would be the next stage of our journey. I would mention as well that the first set of credits that we have currently put up for verification is for the period 2016 to 2020. So I think that makes the case that what we've paid attention to throughout our journey is not a stop-start based on what strategy is in place or what political administration is in place or where the UNFCCC is with its negotiation. But it has been a consistent, dedicated, committed effort to moving the programs that we have designed way back in 2010, even before in some cases, through the point of implementation where now its value could be recognized to bring back in, to circle back in resources to make those activities be able to continue, EITI, EU flagged, MRV, and all of those now be able to continue into the future. So I think I've gone over my time, Florence, my apologies, but my promise to share this presentation with everyone who's on the call and to invite you as well to have a closer look at the LCDS. As I mentioned, we are currently in the stage of consultations, and we would welcome feedback on how we can improve the document, how we can address aspects which you believe could be clarified, and certainly to receive any kind of further details and information you think would be valuable to the process. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pradeepa. Thank you for that very informative presentation. I just want to add that I'm not sure, is there a deadline or is this end of this month still the standing time for any comments that the public may have towards the document?
Thank you, Florence. If you would agree, may I ask Ms. Vanessa Ben to just answer that briefly?
Just quickly, because just that you brought it up, so I
thank you.
just want to clear it up.
Thank you, Pradeepa, and good afternoon, everyone. Vanessa Ben here. Just saying that, yes, initially, it was publicized that the 28th of February is the deadline. However, it is going to be extended, and that will be publicized very shortly. So right now, we are in the process of planning a 3-month consultation process across the communities. And throughout that period, we will be receiving comments from stakeholders across the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Good. So we are at the point in the discussion where we would ask the other panelists. So Curtis, Aisha, Thomas, do you have any questions, comments, any contribution towards Pradeepa's presentation? I know we have some. Sorry, go ahead. Yes, Curtis.
None from me, Alexi, other than what I will have in my presentation and then hopefully in the discussion at the end.
Okay. Aisha?
Thank you, Florence. Same for me too. I don't have any additional comments currently, but maybe following the presentations.
Nothing for me either.
Okay, good. So I know we have some questions in from the chat. So what I can do is I can share a couple with you. Pradeepa, I know one of the
Sorry, Alexi, if I just jump in, can we save the questions until everyone's done their presentations?
Sure, no
yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so I have a question for you, Pradeepa. I know we're going towards, Ms. Ben said she's going towards the 3-month community consultation with the LCDS, the new LCDS 2030 document. So how does the common man fit into this whole new LCDS 2030? How do they see themselves fitting into this new picture?
So I think, so that's an interesting question because I think it can be viewed from many perspectives. So like, if I can share with you, we've spoken over the last 2 months to a broad range of stakeholders, and that question has come up. How is it we can get involved? The private sector asked us that question. The students from the University of Guyana asked us that question. We spoke with a group of labor union members, and they asked us that question. And for every one of those responses, it was different. So maybe I can share with you the response we gave to the students from the University of Guyana. So they asked, how it is, well, first of all, what is the role of like a student coming out of the University of Guyana in the LCDS, and how it would impact on, student life and the education system for any program within the University of Guyana. And our response was that the whole paradigm of the education sector, and I know this is something that would have been discussed for many years, need to be oriented to the phase of development that we're currently at. So if we're speaking about the integration of the oil and gas economy within our traditional sectors, or if we're speaking about the expectations for health and education now that we're moving towards an expanded economy, a low carbon economy, all of those aspects as students, within the University of Guyana system, they need to see themselves as having a role. So we spoke about curriculum development. We spoke about expanding research and the relationship between research and using that for evidence-based decision-making, which is so vital for every one of the sectors, that the traditional sectors and emerging sectors. We also spoke about the role of being and living within the forest, integrated watershed management and biodiversity, and for those involved in the natural sciences, and how they can get involved now that we have seen a lot of advancement in forest carbon. We're really now only at the starting point of developing areas which could come for biodiversity and integrated watershed management. And a lot of this scientific research could come from our graduates. So, you know, it covers such a broad spectrum of research, of involvement in economic activity and curriculum development. And I think the kinds of interesting responses we got after giving that feedback, I think really makes me hopeful that the kind of relatability for the themes we have within the LCDS could indeed be resonating at the level of the private sector, at student level, as well as for those environmentalists among us. I must say that our response for the private sector was totally different. We spoke about cost of energy, we spoke about the energy mix and about reliability of energy. We spoke about expanded hinterland infrastructure and how that could change the way and the means of doing business. And we also spoke about those aspects in certification and quality assurance within the forestry sector. So I think it depends on where you're sitting and your interest. What LCDS 2030 is seeking to do is to show that relatability from a programmatic sense in terms of what it will mean for you along that low carbon pathway based on where you're positioned. For government, it will be totally different as well. So they're looking to have ways in which they can meet the VN, they can have a VNR, a voluntary national report that has high marks on each one of the SDGs. LCDS 2030 would have a role in that as well. So hopefully, whether it is complete and comprehensive, perhaps not. I think there are a lot of areas that could be included. And for that reason, I didn't mention it, but I think now would be a good time to do so. Accompanying the LCDS 2030 finalization process will be the development of an investment plan that is coming out from discussions at the stakeholder level, and that would see the identification of programmatic areas to take forward LCDS 2030 implementation. What programs need to be done, how it will be funded, will it be short, medium, or long term? What will be the means of measuring the success of those programs? And then how will it link and connect to the broader objectives and goals, like under the SDGs or the IG targets? So that investment plan is being developed in parallel, and it was intended to draw on stakeholder feedback within this process.
Thank you so much for that response. Thank you so much, Pradeepa, for your presentation. Folks, we'll now be moving to the second panelist. And the second panelist is no other than Mr. Curtis Bernard. He is Curtis Bernard is Conservation International Guyana's Executive Director and has been involved in environmental management at the technical, middle, and sector management levels for more than 2 decades. Curtis played key roles in the processes for the identification and revision of the priority areas for conservation in the Guyana Shield. Curtis has engaged in initiatives related to extractive and the environment in Guyana, Suriname, and Liberia, and is experienced with the application of the mitigation hierarchy and design of biodiversity offsets. A graduate of the University of Guyana and Duke University Nicholas School of Environment, he holds degrees as a Bachelor of Science in Biology and a Master's of Environment Management. Ladies and gentlemen, Curtis Bernard.
He's muted.
Curtis, you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. I guess it's not an online presentation unless somebody starts to speak muted. Yeah, thanks a lot, Alexi, and thanks to the Moray House Trust for the opportunity to share a perspective on the LCDS. In my discussion, I will focus mainly on Guyana's opportunity here for really demonstrating global leadership in sustainable development. Guyana's potential for development or sustainable development is one that has been spoken about for many eons probably. And there's no doubt that development is needed to better the life of Guyanese. But as we pursue development, we should really take into consideration the examples from around the world where development has resulted in unexpected negative consequences for many, particularly people who are nature dependent. And in many cases, what we look to do is to swap out their dependence on nature for jobs, financial, and other benefits. But in exchange for that, they lose access to important resources and so on. Guyana really has an opportunity to demonstrate truly sustainable development that really avoids these kinds of pitfalls. And I think really in demonstrating what the type of development or the type of perspective that we should have when we think about development, many times we try to measure development in economic sense purely from the perspective of growth in GDP, which is really just a measure of production. I'm not an economist, and my colleague, Dr. Singh on the panel would be much more versed and qualified to speak on this particular topic. But from our perspective, we focus on development really from a total wealth perspective, which is a concept that was put out by, is used really by the World Bank. And I think they've done now 4 or 5 assessments of the wealth of countries and looking at how not only the production side of countries, but really focus on 3 pools of capital. The natural capital, which is really the natural wealth, the things that God has provided to us or that nature provides to us, depending on how you believe in this. And it's really made up of renewable resources and non-renewable resources that we can use to advance how we sustain our livelihoods and how we look to improve our well-being. There's also the produced capital, which are the factories and the kinds of things that we manufacture to be able to make a livelihood. And there's also the social or intangible capital, which is the way that we work together, the systems that are set up, how the society functions, the rule of law, and these kinds of areas so really, if you look at these 3 pools of capital, this is really a way that you can measure how well the country is moving out, how well we're actually developing. What we feel is that true development should really focus on growing total wealth. And to do that in Guyana's context, the foundation of it must be that we are maintaining our renewable natural resources. We must manage how we draw down on our non-renewable natural resources. And importantly, we must use what we earn from the monetization or the utilization of our natural resources, really to grow our social and produce capital to sustain our development going into the future. So I share this frame really just to give you a perspective of how we view sustainable development. In terms of pursuing this kind of development, it's my perspective that Guyana has really shown some commitment to this. As Pradeepa mentioned, this focus started in 2008, 2009, and is sustained today through various, four administrations really, if you think of it over that period. And this, I think, is a remarkable footing on which we can really build and really demonstrates that there is a strong political will to work towards this kind of development. The LCDS 2030, I think, is a good demonstration of the commitment and the broadened focus of the 2030 strategy as against the strategy that was first put out in 2009 is absolutely important for us pursuing this kind of development and for the realization of Guyana's potential, as I mentioned, to really demonstrate truly sustainable development. But there are a couple of things that I would like to mention that we should keep in mind, and I think we need to focus on and improve as we go forward in implementing the LCDS 2030. The first is a recognition that Guyana is key in addressing the global issue of climate change. Both Guyana and the world need the carbon that's within our forest and other ecosystems to remain there if we are to be able to address the issue and the problem of climate change and really avert the more serious consequences of climate change. And more important, or I think to add to that importance, Guyana also has a lot of the carbon that is contained within Guyana's ecosystems, especially our mangroves, peatlands, and wetlands. That carbon cannot be restored within a time frame that is short enough should we lose it to be able to help to address the issue of climate change. And therefore, what Guyana really needs is to find ways to make the conservation of ecosystems economically competitive with extractive uses. And I think, again, this development thrust that we've been on for over the past decade really provides that kind of a direction that we should be going in. So we see the forest carbon program, which is, as Pradeepa described, the center of LCDS 2030, as one of the key parts of improving the competitiveness of forest and ecosystem conservation as an economic activity, and to keeping the carbon that I mentioned is so critical stored. But for this program, the potential of this program to be really emphasized and to be realized, the international community really needs to, I think, the recognition of carbon pools in what are called high forest, low deforestation jurisdictions like Guyana need to be recognized and recognize that it's real actions that will result in the maintenance of the carbon in these critical pools. And therefore, the implementation of the program, the forest carbon program within Guyana really is deserving of international recognition and support. But outside of the recognition and the support, it really needs to come from external sources for this program to really have the kind of transformational and innovative potential that it has. Then there are a couple of things that we must focus on internally in Guyana as well. And I'll focus the rest of my presentation there really from a perspective of providing solutions or potential solutions or areas where we really need to either continue what we're doing or improve what we're doing substantially. First of all, sure.
You have 5 minutes to focus on
Sure.
the solutions. So.
Definitely. So first of all, we must focus on the growth of non-extractive economic activities within our ecosystem, such as nature-based and ecotourism, and finding other innovative ways of generating revenues, utilizing the ecosystems, utilizing intact ecosystems and the services they provide. And even as we implement actions that really do require the removal or other kinds of impacts to ecosystems, we must be able to manage those impacts. So the unintended negative impacts on people, ecosystems, and biodiversity in the climate, we must actively manage those, and we must put mechanisms, including safeguards, monitoring systems, enforcement, and so on, to minimize those unintended impacts. This is just a demonstration of the slide that I'm showing, or the images on this slide, but it's really just a demonstration of the application of what's called the mitigation hierarchy, which is a means of trying to ensure that as you implement development projects, that the net impact on biodiversity ecosystem minimized, or if it can be brought to zero, and in the best cases really have a net positive impact. And we need to be taking this kind of approach in all of the developmental projects that are outlined within the LCDS 2030. An area where we've been very strong is in demonstrating results. From the outset of the Guyana-Norway agreement, Guyana established really a cutting-edge, state-of-the-art monitoring system for our forests. And over the past 10 years, we have reliably provided verified information on the amount of forests that we've lost. And we've also equated that to the emissions that come from our forests. And this system is one that must be built on and expanded to cover co-benefits such as fresh water and biodiversity. We must also seek innovative solutions. So we need innovations to strengthen the economic viability of non-extractive uses of ecosystems, also to focus on the restoration of ecosystems such as mangroves and coastal defense. That's absolutely necessary for our continued existence as a country and our sustained development into the future. So innovations are absolutely necessary also besides the restoration and finding new economic activities, we also need innovations to decarbonize our existing industries and reduce the impact of our existing industries, whether it's mining, forestry, agriculture, and so on ecosystems and also on emissions. So in closing, I would just use some of the words of the very famed poet Martin Carton, saying that all are involved, all are consumed, and really trying to achieve the multiple development, greenhouse gas emissions, and conservation targets that are set out within the LCDS will require integrated planning, integrated monitoring, and the management of execution. And doing all of this in a way in which all of Guyana is actively engaged in the implementation, as all of us would be impacted by it. So with that, I'd like to close and thank you again for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you.
Thank you so much, Curtis. Indeed, you are correct. Integrated everything is the way to go. Folks, I know you're so excited to share your questions, but if we just hold them, then we can focus on the presentation that is going on a little bit more. And you will have up to a whole half an hour to ask your questions, and you have really good questions and really good comments that everyone else can benefit from. So if we can just focus on, and if it is a case where you don't get to ask your question, then we can put it in the chat. But let's try to focus on one presentation at a time at the moment. Panelists, do you have any questions or comments for Curtis?
So sorry, I'm going to weigh in because I'm concerned about the time. Can we save the questions till after all the presenters have spoken, and then we will, the
Okay, no
panelists can
problem.
have their minutes. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Okay, good. So our next panelist is the country manager, Guyana's country manager for WWF, and she has been in this post since 2015. She holds a master's degree in conservation and tourism from the University of Kent and a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Guyana. She has extensive expertise in biodiversity conservation, freshwater and protected areas management, and inclusive conservation and partner relations and stakeholder engagement. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Ms. Aisha Williams.
Thank you so much, Florence, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm honored to be a part of Moray's House session this evening, and I'm glad to be among my esteemed colleagues to share with you our thoughts and perspectives. And I will zoom in a little bit further and focus on three broad areas of the LCDS. What it contains in general terms, and also what I think and what we think at WWF that can enhance the LCDS further in these three areas, because we believe that it's important in a country like ours to have people and nature thriving in harmony, and this means also in development. For communities, national development, and even people development. And so I'll go straight in and not spend much more time on the introduction. The first area, there are three areas I will cover: gold mining, fresh water, and protected areas, and conserving other critical areas. And these are the three areas. There are a number of things that will come into here. Some of it will touch on and building on what Curtis and Pradeepa have said already. So within the LCDS, when it comes to gold mining, this is really an important aspect that needs to be included in the low carbon development strategy. And so already the strategy outlines the importance of having and focusing on mineral mapping, increasing mine site reclamation and reforestation, and also improving planning in mining areas, from the setup of operations, where they are and what their focus is, to ensure that it's more responsible and less impactful on forests, and also integrating forestry and mining in these two sectors, ensuring that there's an integrated management for these two sectors. And that these are important, as well as gender inclusivity. I was pleased to see specifics around gold mining and gender, and ensuring that this is prioritized. And there are opportunities and equity for women, but also it's important for communities and other vulnerable groups. And while these measures do really help to maintain intact forests and will definitely contribute to low carbon development, I believe that there are also some other measures that can be taken to contribute to this positive way of adding other measure, other development, some of which are currently on the way. Other measures are on the way and can increase the positive contribution of gold mining to low carbon development. This is because there are drivers prevailing contexts which may even prove to undermine these efforts. For instance, improved recovery of gold, using techniques that are proven, tested, and suitable for Guyana's context is important, so that with mine site closure, and also, there's a tendency to go back into these areas because people know that, they didn't get the full 100% within the area. due to the techniques that are used, how miners are moving, the plans that they have been putting in place, they know that gold is within that area, and so they return. So if there are measures to improve recovery, then the closure of an area from mining is definitely that is seen. Additionally, assessing and consolidating lessons from reclamation. So I'm happy that there is reclamation included. However, we have to look at what were the lessons learned as it relates to the need, what sort of policy and legislation is needed. Also on the ground, lessons that were learned, like what should be planted, where, when, how, and what sort of measures should be taken. All these lessons should be applied in moving forward with reclamation. Additionally, there should be reforms, legislative reform, minimizing negative impacts on responsible gold mining. So it is improving policy, legislation, keeping up to date with the changes that the country move towards, including mercury phasing out, including measures for reclamation that require, stronger legislation to make things happen, and ensure that there is commitment for these improvements. It's important, and I'm not sure that I saw it within the LCDS, to also have monitoring enforcement continue. There are a number of codes of practices, and also the Mining Act, Environmental Protection Act, but there needs to be enforcement of what's already there and monitoring to ensure that all the measures that are stipulated are followed, so that mining can positively contribute to low carbon development, and not undermining, other measures that are taken within the mining sector, but also within the forestry and other areas. And also it's important to incentivize best practices. And best practice incentivize, meaning it could be on the financial side, it could be in terms of technical support, and various means, working with the mining sector and working with miners themselves to understand what sort of, incentivized measures really make sense, because you want to make sure that that makes sense and really incentivize them for taking on best practices beyond maybe what would have been would be legislative, but can be attractive for them in terms of greater earnings and revenue, can be help them to connect to more responsible supply chains. So mercury-free technologies and investing in these and demonstrating how they can be used and ensuring that they do apply to the various sectors would be important. And of course, partnering to ensure that the mining sector in Guyana can connect to responsible supply chain, which also have their measures in place, which really helps to enhance the positive contribution of gold mining. On to freshwater now. Freshwater resources management being included in the LCDS is really a positive. I was happy. I've been interested in water management at the beginning of my career and even at the start of WWF, and seeing a focus on freshwater management and all these important areas being included was really exciting, and I believe that it is a positive direction in which the LCDS is going, and ensuring that this critical resource, this important resource for human health, for development for a country like ours, and for the environmental values and functions that freshwater ecosystems provide, it is right to be in the center, or as it is, as carbon is in the low carbon development strategy. So it, you know, the aspect of the LCDS has the aspect of water management, developing water management strategies, plans at the administrative region level, and even protecting key watersheds. Mentioning all of these and including all of these in the LCDS is very important. Water governance, and also addressing allocation and supply rights of different water users to access to water, efficient use of water, water quality, water quantity, research, all these things Pradeepa mentioned also is included in the LCDS, along with the link of water and agriculture and food security. All of this is included in the LCDS, and I think this is a great move. However, there can also be, some additional specifics in the LCDS that can help to really centralize the way in which water is managed and contributes and is maintained, and the LCDS really contributes to the preservation of water resources. So this, for instance, would include including ecosystem values and approaches into water governance. A lot was focused within in the section on water governance. A lot was focused on in the institutions and the stakeholders, which is very important. But also having taking that including that basin-wide approach and protecting headwaters. Focusing on wetlands management, both coastal and interior, is an important aspect that will really enhance the freshwater management section, and also not only interior and coastal freshwater systems, but also their wetlands that are man-made, like the conservancies. I'm not sure how many people realize that they've moved beyond. Well, if you go to the place, it looks so natural that you wouldn't realize that it's built wetlands. And so treating it now with the natural and hydrological flow that are occurring there, and treating those functions and managing the freshwater system beyond supply of water for agriculture is an important, or even for economic development, household supply. It's important to include all these aspects and also the ecological functions in applying freshwater management to these areas. And in addition, diving in a bit more on the relation of agriculture, food security, and fresh water, and ensuring that we harness the efforts and knowledge of communities, agro-businesses, to positively contribute to freshwater ecosystem protection and management, ensuring that, as I said before, the supply is not the only focus. Because of the ecological functions, this hydrological flow, the function of wetlands and rivers in purifying the water supply that is necessary for agriculture. All these values should be maintained, should be ensure that it's close to the heart, close to the operations of the agriculture sector, to ensure that actions that are taken to manage fresh water really also benefits and maintains the functions of the ecosystem.
Aisha, I don't mean to break your train of thought, but you need to get on to the third topic.
Sure, I'll move on. I'll just wrap up here and move on.
Okay, thank you.
I didn't change slides, but also the fact that not only agricultural sectors, but also all other economic sectors should be positively contributing to freshwater management, and be mindful of the impacts their actions and the positive actions and the negative actions that can affect freshwater systems. Now on to the third area on protected areas and conservation of critical areas. This is also a major addition to the LCDS, considering the previous phase, where there are emphasis on broader ecosystem services and biodiversity, also protecting of watersheds, marine ecosystems, improving existing and expanding on new protected areas, terrestrial protected areas, ensuring that the country's maintaining its commitments, international commitments to many of the commitments that the country has made, for instance, to the Global Ocean Alliance, the Global Biodiversity Framework, the Aichi targets, and so many other commitments that are meant to maintain biodiversity, meant to maintain important ecosystems. And Guyana is no different from many other countries. Actually, we're exceptional in the amount of biodiversity and the difference in ecosystems that we have. And so it is exceptional also that co-management measures, including communities, including various stakeholders in the management of protected areas and other areas that can maintain biodiversity, including this in the LCDS, really is exceptional. However, at the same time, a focus on the urgency. So the urgency in actioning this strategy to make sure that there are efforts already moving ahead to manage the existing protected areas, to plan for the expansion and having the expansion of new protected areas is a matter of urgency because there's so much biodiversity loss globally. Guyana can boast that there generally biodiversity and ecosystems are intact. However, the threats are increasing, the pressures are increasing, and so moving to the next step after the finalization of consultations and ensuring that all inputs are included, then moving to the next step is really urgent. And definitely the country wouldn't be starting from zero because already efforts have, successive governments, the institutions, partners like WWF, CI, and so on have been working together to plan, identify critical areas, spatially, but also processes and roadmaps as to what process should follow to achieve new protected areas, and also to ensure that there's good management. There is a move towards understanding that protected areas is not the answer to everything and protecting biodiversity, but also other effective area-based management is an approach to ensure that biodiversity is protected across the board and not only in protected areas. It can be areas managed by private sector and businesses, communities, Amerindian indigenous communities, other local communities, and even government managing areas outside of protected areas. And it's important to also, within these management measures, both protected areas and other conservation measures, to also ensure that there's connectivity, even where there are development and extractives done, there should be connectivity to ensure that biodiversity is maintained, the intact forest landscape is maintained, freshwater systems and river basins are maintained, and so many different other ecosystems are maintained. And also ensuring that there's representativeness. So there's every aspect, different type of ecosystem is protected and conserved because they are important for the well-being and development of the country and people.
Indeed, they are.
can't
Thank you so
forget
much, Aisha.
Just one more point on financing. Sorry about that. One more point on ensuring that there's sustainable financing and harnessing the benefits out of managing these areas, as Curtis mentioned. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for that. You'll have another opportunity to share more information during the question and answer segment. In the interest of time, I now wish to introduce Dr. Thomas B. Singh, who is the Director of the University of Guyana Green Institute and Senior Lecturer in the Department of Economics. He has a PhD in economics, the title of his dissertation being To Trust or Not to Trust Others. This is a very interesting dissertation in the context of our presentation today. Norms, interactions, and institutions. His research interests are generally in applied microeconomics, and he is also the president of the Epilepsy Foundation of Guyana. Dr. Singh, welcome, sir.
Good evening, and thank you very much, moderator. Good evening, all. It's a real privilege to be here. You can hear me, can you? Very well then. So pardon me as I just try to, or if you can do it for me, if you could close my video, turn off my video, I'd be grateful. I really don't know how to do that. At any rate, let's continue. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you to my to Isabel and the Moray House for having invited me. And then secondly, I'd like to thank my colleague presenters who've gone before me. The LCDS 2030, a green economy scorecard, I am presenting in my private capacity, personal capacity, but I do recognize in the audience Professor Jay Mandel, Professor Jose Lobo, both of whom are, advisory board members for the Green Institute, and I therefore would like to say that I'm not speaking for the Green Institute as such. So what I plan on doing is the following. I'll tell you a little bit about, since we want to talk about a green economy scorecard, about Guyana, the things that define Guyana as Guyana, to talk as well about what is a green economy, what is green growth, to move on to some comments on the LCDS and some options that I'm going to propose for this LCDS, much in the spirit of what Aiesha just did. Then I'll present the beginnings of a green economy scorecard, and we'll then roundabout conclude after that. Please, moderator, do tell me if I'm going beyond time. I'll try not to. What are the things that define Guyana as Guyana? Our resource abundance is one of the obvious ones. And now we have, precisely because of that resource abundance, a deep paradox between Guyana as a high forest cover, low deforestation, biodiversity rich country that has now become an oil producer. Associated with that resource abundance is, importantly, the non-market nature of the resource rents that are associated, that the resource abundance throws up. Concomitantly, and precisely because of the nature of rents, the non-market nature, there is a tendency for government to be large, because when it comes to rents, until these rents become income and endowments that people use in a market system, those rents have to be allocated by some political process. There's also the fact that ours is a non-homogeneous population with ethnic divisions and polity and politics that correspond to that particular population. Ours is also a low trust, norm-based economy and society, which means that the role of incentives and of the things that will, the architecture that will govern decision-making tends to be peculiar to such an economy, low trust, norm-based. So these things, I believe, define Guyana as Guyana, and make, in point of fact, the framing of a green economy particularly relevant and important. So a green economy, as we tend to say, is built on three pillars: the economy, the society, and the environment. Economic growth is inclusive as long as that pillar, the economy, interfaces with, or I shouldn't say interfaces with, but as long as we policymakers and academics alike recognize that economy is not a standalone entity, but there's our society. All those things in mind, our quest for growth would take on the flavor of inclusive growth. And likewise, if in our economic growth, we took cognizance of the environmental resource base, then our growth might in fact reflect the concerns about sustainability that Aiesha just talked about. This graphic is taken from a World Bank publication, by the way. I thought I'd provide some definitions of sustainable development before I come to the bold at the bottom, which I believe is a useful way of talking about what we mean by sustainable development. We all know the Brundtland Commission's statement that sustainable development is defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The OECD talks about green growth as fostering economic growth and development while ensuring that natural assets continue to provide the resources and the environmental services on which our well-being relies. And then there's this third definition here. This green growth would result in improved human well-being and social equity while significantly reducing environmental risks and ecological scarcities. So if you were to think about it a little bit, the definitions, all of them talk about our natural capital, about environmental sustainability, about the needs of the present and future generations, needs that have to be balanced. And so I suggest that the economist's rendering of this is a very useful one, the one in bold. Green growth or sustainability perhaps is a path of consumption, mind you, consumption, that maximizes the present discounted value of intertemporal welfare over time by an appropriate choice of consumption and investment in each period. Note here, we're talking about consumption and about the level of well-being that the society enjoys over time because of its consumption of goods and services, of nature, of amenities, and so forth. As we like to say, the things that enter into the utility function or the social welfare function, when we say consumption, can be unpacked to include all of those things. But what we'd emphasize here is that this consumption doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the productive base of the economy. And a slide presented by Curtis, my colleague, presenter, referred to total wealth. You know, that is our social capital, our natural wealth. And that total wealth is the productive base of the economy that gives rise to consumption possibilities. So the idea is sustaining consumption over time. Because naturally, if we were to overinvest, it means we are lowering consumption today to do so, unless we have a bonanza like oil. Or if we were to overconsume, then if we took the entire length of consumption from now to infinity, and we tried to maximize, we realize that our consumption and investment choices might not have actually yielded the maximum. There's one more thing I'd like to say about this definition here, is that it does not address, and I think I come to it in the next, well, a little later on, it does not address intratemporal equity. It does, however, capture that dimension that people talk about these days, intertemporal equity is actually preserved if we were to follow this rule here. So some comments on the LCDS, and I divide my comments into overall comments on the LCDS overall and some specific comments. By the way, I'll leave us to ask questions and discuss things that would connect the dots to the end. I'm not going to try to connect all the dots. So here are the overall comments. The LCDS, and they're made respectfully. The LCDS 2030, on the one hand, and the aggressive oil development on the other hand, adopted by our country, are independent, parallel strategies. A green economy, however, comes out of to use that word, a holistic strategy for the economy, the society, and the environment, getting to perhaps the soul of our country, if you will. Whereas having the LCDS providing the counterbalance for the aggressive oil development is probably not as holistic as one might want to see in a green economy. The second thing to note about the LCDS 2030 is that while there are discussions about public-private partnerships and that sort of thing, it is government, a government that, mind you, as I said before, will be responsible for the allocation of significant rents in the economy. It is government that will be driving all the major planks of the LCDS. And thirdly, the threat, risks, and costs of rising sea levels on a vulnerable coast are, in my view, heavily discounted in the LCDS, whereas a green economy perspective would urge us to ask the question, as Professor J. Mandel had done, shall we use our oil revenues, for example, in part, to consider a movement off the coast, or some sort of response to this threat and risk that I'm talking about?
5 minutes remaining, Dr. Singh.
Pardon me?
I'll give you 5 minutes remaining. I'll tell you when you have to.
Thank you. So some specific comments here. The Art Trees Leaf Coalition Voluntary Offset Scheme. It's a major plank in the LCDS, but as yet it's still aspirational for Guyana. And there's some questions that arise that need to be addressed at some stage. That's to say, are we attempting to double dip? Meaning on the one hand, trying to sell the credit offsets, while on the other hand, claiming that they're achieving net zero. The accounting is really careful about this sort of thing. Well, as far as I understand, Amerindian titled land has not been excised from state forests, state land. So the question will arise, you know, whose rights are these, the carbon offsets that we're selling? Thirdly, and I believe very importantly, if we're going to be claiming that our forests have a value because of the carbon offsets they provide, then I believe the logic that confronts us is to say as well that the crude oil that we have, which also sequesters carbon dioxide, is also a value that if we don't actually address it, it will end up counterbalancing and offsetting entirely what we claim to be the value of our forests. Another specific comment is that there is emphasis as well on hydroelectricity, but in the context of energy transition, my own view is that technology it looks backward, and then again it raises this question, this disturbing question about what would happen to the carbon offsets when forested areas that are stored in the forest, when significant areas of the forest might be flooded. So I provide, however, some options as we go forward. One of them in particular is an upstream carbon tax at the wellhead that puts a price on the carbon sequestered in each barrel of oil that's going to be produced, and revenue that would come to Guyana if we were to use this upstream carbon tax mechanism. It has incidentally a significant an acknowledged mitigation effect. Furthermore, the revenues, we believe, can be used to finance climate adaptation, for example. Another option is advanced biofuels, and I'm referring particularly to the production of cellulosic ethanol based in the sugar industry. I saw that General Electric is interested in ethanol, but it is interested in old-fashioned ethanol. And what we believe, if one wants to use technology as forward-looking, you should be thinking about something like cellulosic ethanol. Aisha talked a lot about the regulatory framework. I don't need to say anything more. I need to say, however, that that chapter has to do with oil, preparedness and management, regulatory management, ought to consider something like an oil spill act. And I mean that seriously. Another option is to think that, well, recognize that diversification might not happen because it's written into a document or a set of documents, but we need to develop a strategy for this. So I close now with some elements of a green economy scorecard, and I'll just go through these items. So the question is, does the LCDS 2030 promote these following things? Does it promote intergenerational equity, which is a particular challenge given the dominance of resource rents and Guyana's peculiar social and political order? Does it promote increased market size and effective demand, which is especially important for sectors that do not have secure markets, export or domestic? Does it promote innovation and learning, especially as it relates to key cross-cutting issues such as energy, or if you will, energy transition? Does it promote the replacement of extracted natural capital to preserve the economy's asset base so that the returns to those assets can continue to support livelihoods? Does it provide for employment growth outside of the dominant oil sector, making livelihoods more sustainable and more secure, even in terms of where we live, to make reference to that comment I made about the coastal area here? Does it promote a diversified economy? Does it promote macroeconomic stability, or is it going to contribute to inflation? Does it, and Aisha spoke about this one here, does it promote the stability of the environmental resource base, notwithstanding the resource extraction that might be happening elsewhere? Does it ultimately help us to avoid the resource curse? And I might want to suggest that Guyana has actually had earlier experiences with the resource curse. And have we learned from them? Are we going to avoid them? So how much better will Guyana be as a society and a polity in 2030 after the LCDS, in 2050 and even beyond? I close finally with something on diversification and on green industrialization, to say that there is, a model. It's known as big push industrialization, and if we were to think of greening it, I believe the advanced biotechnologies might help us to do that. But the issue is the following. It's in the graphic there. If we can have large-scale investment in many sectors simultaneously because of the so-called increasing returns nature of gold mining and oil extraction and so forth, then we might have complementarity of demand between sectors. The size of the market would expand. There would be that effective demand I spoke about, and the economy would grow and develop in a sustainable way, as long as that industrialization is of the green, big push nature. Thank you very much, moderator. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So much, Dr. Singh. Thank you to all of the panelists for your presentations. We are now at a point in the program where we can have our questions answered. How we're going to do this is you can raise your hand or you can put your question in the chat section. The Ulrich Trotz has raised his hand.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
Just some comments. I am a little, just a little concerned of the well, lack of focus also on objective 3 of the LCDS, which deals with climate adaptation. And for us, it has to be a priority as high as low carbon development is given. I wouldn't like it to be pushed in the corner, because that is critical in terms of the very future of Guyana. Are we talking, for instance, about all this onshore development, etc.? But what's the use if a few years down the line, as a result of sea level rise, as a result of the changing weather patterns, all these things are inundated? So the whole question of building climate resilience, I would like to see also given equal visibility. Now, just something about the LCDS. The government, the present government, they prepared an LCDS, and before they demitted office in 2015, they went even further than that. They had a study done which developed something called the CRASP, which is the Climate Resilience Strategy and Action Plan. That action plan actually identified 4 actions under the climate resilience umbrella. One was sea defense, the other was drainage and irrigation, the other was dealing with the health sector, facilities, and the other agriculture. They were costed, and the whole idea was that they would have a fully costed program. The thing is, that study was completed during the after they had demitted office, and the new government came in. As you know, they developed the Green Growth Development Strategy. There is not too much of a difference between the two, in the sense that they both have as their objective building climate resilience, which is the adaptation aspect of it, and the low carbon development. Now we are back with 2030. What I would want to ask is, what is the status of that plan, that implementation, where you had 4 costed activities, and basically they were supposed to be implemented? Are we going forward along that line? The other thing, a very quick comment. This is I'd like to have more time, but in the interest of time, I can't help but raise an issue which I saw, I think it was yesterday, where Mr. Brassington made a statement that GPL would absorb any risks arising from amenity loss with the Amila Falls. That is, if you can't supply energy because of the water flow, then any risk, any losses, etc., are going to be absorbed by the GPL. Now, I have cautioned the idea, you know, Guyana land of many waters, that Amila might not run out of water. If we look around us at other hydroelectric schemes in the Shield, the Brokopondo one in Suriname, they run into great difficulties because of the fact that the water flow recently has been erratic. Venezuela has had the same problems. So we have to be very careful that we fully understand the hydrological regime surrounding Amila. It's not a given that we might run into the same difficulties that our neighbors are running into. And on this point, I've always been pushing. I don't know why we haven't considered offshore wind. For the simple reason that the technology is one of the most mature in terms of renewable energy. And offshore wind in Guyana puts the facility in close proximity to the population, which means that you don't have to invest in that extensive transmission system that we'll have to invest in bringing energy in from the interior. I'm just posing that as an alternative. But the point I want to make is that we need to give equal focus to objective 3 in the LCDS. And as a matter of fact, I will say that the drawdown on the oil revenues right now, actions basically to protect our coasts, protect our populations, basically from the ravages of climate change, are of paramount importance. And that actions under that umbrella should have a priority, and a priority access on those funds as they become available. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Strutz. We have raised hand from Vanda Radzik. Vanda.
Thank you very much, Alexi. I want to just compliment all of the presenters, excellent presentations, and of course, Moray House for hosting this, and Dr. Trotz for his on-point contribution just now. I have put my my questions in chat, but I have to leave for another meeting shortly. So I just wanted to flag 2 things. One, and to maybe the chapeau for this is to Pradeepa and Vanessa, that perhaps the LCDS, could also make some not only strong alternatives, but to make prohibitions where certain economic ventures is going to irreparably damage the whole point about an LCDS and the integrity of our ecosystems, people and planet. So the Takatu Basin of North Rupununi is exactly where the unique North Rupununi wetlands, the wetlands of the Rupununi, that are recognized all over this world for the incredible values that it has. And I was horrified to see that the Takatu Basin is now up again for oil drilling. Respectfully, Pradeepa and Vanessa, I really believe that some of the areas in our country should be prohibited from any more destructive activities. Why on earth would we need more oil drilling anywhere than the massive set that is already destroying the oceans outside? So I just wanted to flag that, and perhaps the LCDS could make strong recommendations to have something like the North Rupununi or the Rupununi wetlands actually made into a conserved area. The wetlands have one of the greatest carbon sinks, and also maybe have that finally designated as a Ramsar site, so that it has the extra layer of protection under international conventions and norms that Guyana would then adhere to. Secondly, I'm not convinced, with all due respect, and I think the LCDS so far is doing quite a good job in its delineations, but there are some big gaps and divergences, and so I am not convinced, respectfully, that Guyana becoming one of the world's largest polluters because of the offshore oil, because of the despoiling daily that is going on now of the wastewater and the bilge from those massive tankers pouring into our oceans all the time. And why is it, and how is it that we could possibly be speaking about low carbon in the same breath as becoming now one of the world's largest polluters, creating climate change, causing global warming, and we are now part of the destruction of our planet. And I don't believe that we can say that our wonderful forests are going to be the catch-all for all of the damage that is being done. And I would really like to see something very strongly articulated in the LCDS that states this fact of us becoming a destroyer, and to state it and to find ways of prohibiting and of cutting back from some of these economic ventures, and to maybe put a break on the drill baby drill that's going on. And finally, many of us in civil society are calling for a moratorium a temporary moratorium on all of this oil and gas development so we can catch our breath as a nation, as a society that Thomas Singh spoke about. And together with an LCDS, find ways of getting a better balance as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanda. Pradeepa, would you like to speak on the dichotomies identified?
So thank you, Alexi. I've noted 3 sets of points. If I could have the opportunity to respond to each of them, those that Thomas raised with regards to offsets, the points that Dr. Trotz raised with regards to the adaptation component, and the points that Vanda just raised in terms of, finding that best balance. So perhaps I can start with the first. Should I go ahead with the first set of feedback and responses?
Go ahead.
So I think the points that Thomas raised, they're quite interested in terms of looking at the broader umbrella of carbon pricing, both in terms of where it's applied. The way that the LCDS has treated with it is with regards to the conserve status. So it's not offsets. So we're not looking to plant forests and to offset something that has been done bad in the past and to reverse that in the current period. So if I can refer to that slide that I presented with conserve, restore, reduce, and remove, Guyana's asset has always been in the conserving tab, because we have had low deforestation rate, low forest degradation rate, and we've been able to maintain largely net positive. So that by itself means that were we to pursue that tab of trying to reduce deforestation, there might be some gains there, but very little, because our rate has been so low. There is only so much you can reduce if the rate is already low. So where we're positioned really is as a high forest cover, low deforestation rate country. And in benefiting from monetizing that tab of conserve. Without that, there would be very little for Guyana in terms of ecosystem services. So that is where our trees, and I see some comments in the chat about the appropriateness of our trees, if I were to rephrase those comments that I see. Our trees is appropriate and relevant and credible because for the first time, it's providing that pathway to the voluntary carbon market that recognize the conserve. So it's not expecting Guyana to replant millions of hectares of forest. There's no place to do so because we've kept forests intact for decades and for centuries. So to be able to have this positioning, and I think it's a really fortunate place that Guyana has been able to be at and to maintain over the last decades of high forest cover, low deforestation rate, our trees really is that, I think, opportune window to give us access to what will be for the first time, the monetizing and the pricing of something that wasn't given a value or a price within the marketplace. So just to make that point, I think Thomas made some other points that I think are very valuable in looking at the broader context of where we're positioning low carbon development. And certainly the areas where he raised, on that last slide on the elements of a good green scorecard, many of those I think are reflected in the LCDS. If I can go to Dr. Professor Trotz's point on the aspect with regards to adaptation. So we have a very comprehensive section on adaptation in the LCDS, and I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to present that to a greater level of detail in the presentation. But we opened that section on page 69 by saying in 2022, work will start in the implementation of Guyana's climate resilience strategy and action plan. So that is our opening statement on the adaptation objective of the LCDS. And this is recognizing that the work done on the CRSAP remains relevant to this day. It would need to be updated in some respects, but largely the document that outlines those main aspects in terms of planning for climate resilience and action to be taken remain broadly what we are pursuing and outlining in the LCDS. To that point, we've covered climate adaptation, resilience, sea defense, climate resilient agriculture, as well as health and other aspects with regards to agriculture. The point is very relevant though, and I think we can do a better job at reflecting that in the final LCDS, in being more proactive rather than reactive. So I take that message as one of the takeaways that I will look at and our team will look at as we revise the LCDS, that being reactive and trying to mitigate against the impacts of climate change and sea defense rise, looking at coastal infrastructure and what needs to be done for those of us who live on the coast, it's very relevant. But at the same time, and in the same breath, we need to be proactive and look at what needs to be done, not just to mitigate, but to also provide for the future where the sea level rise really might end up being to a state where we might have to move further inland. Development of new cities, sustainability planning, looking at new infrastructure and the creating of livelihood opportunities away from the coast, all of those become very relevant. So that is a takeaway for me, to look at that deeply in terms of how we can make that a bit more proactive, in addition to what we've outlined here, but perhaps in a more detailed way. Dr. Trotz made some other very valuable points as well, but I'll take those on board for sure. The aspects on hydropower and offshore wind, I've noted those points which he's raised. In terms of Vanda's comments, so, I think it's important to recognize the true value of everything Guyana is about. We have 19.6 gigatons of carbon stored in the forest. We sequester about 154 million annually. We are by far net positive.
Okay.
Sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought someone was saying something. We are by far net positive in a tremendous way, even with the number of FPSOs we have right now and an increase in the FPSOs by 2030 and even beyond. Guyana will continue to be net positive because of that asset of the forest. I understand Vanda's point that it's not going to be the single solution to everything we do, and we can't just look to the forest and say we want to do anything else because the forest is there conserving carbon. The facts remain that scientifically, what we have to account for and report are those aspects that have to do with our energy use and our energy demand. And that is why the large focus of the LCDS is on decarbonizing that. And we've presented an energy matrix to do just that. The energy and the fossil fuel that is used onshore, that is part of what we have to account for. And that is not an excuse to say that we are not globally advocating for those aspects that remain important to the LCDS, a strong global carbon price, and for there to be removal of subsidies in fossil fuel. For in the medium to long term, when there is a decrease in fossil fuel, for that to also be the situation where Guyana is at, where we're not dependent on that. So I make that point to say that we are largely net positive. We will remain so as well, even with the increase in numbers of FPSOs. I fully agree with Vanda, though, the point which she raised that when we look at expanding the protected areas, certainly aspects with regards to all the ecosystem value, watershed management, biodiversity aspects, could be very important aspects that we look at as we expand our current 8.3% to 17% and potentially to 30% by 2030. And the point she raised, consideration of engaging in the Ramsar, in the work that would have started already, but perhaps not accelerated on Ramsar, those could be taken forward. That is a takeaway message for me. But just to note that, we look at our development in sectors and in pockets. The way I think that would be valuable, certainly the way that we have positioned LCDS 2030, is to look at it as a holistic umbrella. And in my view, LCDS 2030 is even more important now because of what is happening in the oil and gas sector and the accelerated growth of the oil and gas sector. We need to have these measures outlined, what will be done to diversify the economy, and certainly what will be done to ensure strong environmental measures in the oil and gas sector and continued advocacy for there to be reductions in fossil fuel in the global environment. So that is where it's positioned, and I think that is going to be the pathway that allow for us to build our economy locally while still aspiring to those global goals that we've set out in the LCDS.
Thank you so much, Pradeepa. Dr. Thomas, do you have anything that you would like to add? Dr. Singh?
Hi there, good evening. Thank you so much. Not really, I'm not particularly. Perhaps the only thing I wanted to say is that I believe it's a matter of terminology. I believe that we speak of carbon credits when we're talking about compliance markets, but it's not an issue, So I don't think we should take up time with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, folks. We are approaching wrap-up time, so I would advise you, so that we can get in as many questions and responses as possible, I would advise you to keep it very concise. Jocelyn, your question, please.
Thank you. Thanks all. To be concise, it's to me there is an inherent contradiction in how we are proceeding, at least at the moment, and that is that all about green and sustainability is about limit. We are supposed to limit our personal consumption. We're supposed to limit our use of natural resources. We're supposed to try for more equitable distribution of things. And part of what concerns me in the two, as Thomas said, parallel lines, is that we are into massive use, and we're speaking about conservation at the same time. So, it was raised in a previous thing that I was in. What is the philosophical basis in which we are proceeding as an economy or as a country, and certainly as a green strategy? A strategy is a strategy. What is the basis of it? What are the principles that we are planning to espouse and adhere to? And to me, that is significantly missing from this entire thing. And I mean, we could go into it further, but it takes up to me many of the points that other people have been raising in the chat and everything else. What is are the principles under which we are operating? Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Anyone from the panel wishes to comment on Jocelyn's point?
The issue that Jocelyn raised, if I might, this is Thomas Singh here.
Yes.
About consumption and about restraint in consumption. It is at the crux of things, and I think what we ought to recognize is that movements such as the energy transition one, and even the desire, not the requirements that our logs must be sustainably harvested. There are two sides to this, but one side being, rules, government regulations, and so forth. But the other side is that it really does come from changing consumer preferences. And that is why we are not to take lightly the notion that maybe our oil could be left as stranded assets at some point. Now, that's not to say necessarily that we are to go and extract the oil immediately and as fast as possible and so forth. I'm providing, however, a framework within which we might think of consumption as driving the outcomes that we see globally even. I don't know if that sort of helps, but I agree that the issue of restraint in consumption is not just personal either. It's driven by global norms even. So I'd like to thank Jocelyn for that comment, in fact.
Thank you, Thomas. Pradeepa, you want to put in something quickly, or you'll pass?
No, it's fine, Alexi.
Okay, then, good. Zelini, Khan.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for participating. First of all, congratulations on achieving the Art Tree thing. I think that's a really wonderful incentive for conservation of our forests. But Dr. Singh made a point about politicians are the ones that are going to be deciding on which projects go ahead. And when I compare the low carbon development strategy with, say, Dr. Ashni Singh's budget speech, and I do a bit of math in my Excel spreadsheet, I can add up to around 500,000 hectares allocated for mining and quarrying. I think there's around 2 million hectares allocated for forestry. And I'm wondering, what is the sort of connection between that strategy and those projects? When on the one hand, we're trying to conserve our natural resources and our biodiversity, and we're talking about the Aichi targets for biodiversity, and we have all of these wonderful standards and agreements under which we're hoping to retain our 99.5% forest cover. And on the other hand, we have a budget speech that to me throws everything in the face of those ideals. That's just one quick question. And then the second question is there anything within the low carbon development strategy to address poverty reduction and issues like the issues with fishermen and the sort of problems they're facing? Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Pradeepa, Aisha.
Sure. Perhaps I can just give quick reflections on the 2 points which were raised. The first on the allocation within the budget in terms of areas for forestry and mining. And I think the other point raised on poverty. So maybe the first one first. In the case of the forest sector, I know that in the budget speech there is, and I can't remember the exact figure, but there's a certain quantity of forest area that has been allocated, that has been identified for productive purposes. So I think as many of us on the call know, the way that forest management occurs in Guyana is through sustainable forest management principles, which means that there is a limit, and to Jocelyn's point, as to how much could be taken out in a given hectare. And that is ring-fenced by the code of practice for timber harvesting, which would have been developed and fine-tuned over the years. And it is also spoken to in terms of other aspects of planning and forest inventory work, which need to be done even before those areas could be subject to production. What we've seen over the years is that Guyana can take out close to 1 million cubic meters from the state forest estate. The level of production is about half of that. So only half of that sustainable annual maximum is really what is harvested. About 300,000 to 400,000 cubic meters are reported annually in terms of production. So that tallies to per hectare about 3 to 5 trees taken out in an entire hectare. So by no way would any kind of sustainable forest management practice, either at community level, large concession level, or small concession level, impact on any loss in forest cover, to the point where we've seen timber harvesting in those 10 years I've presented in that MRV graph. We've seen undulating movement in timber production over that period, going from 300,000 to close to 600,000 cubic meters over that period. Yet our rate of deforestation and forest degradation remain low and remain flat. And it is because of those principles which have been set up, and principles which allow for us now to effectively engage in programs such as the EU FLEG program, which is based on forest legality, and the certification program, which is PEFC certification that is outlined in the LCDS. So in terms of the aspect on forest management, from everything we've seen, from the existence of all the documents and guidelines that are out there and that are available to guide the sector that they're regulated against, there is no indication that any of this would lead to large scale or even small scale deforestation within the forest area of Guyana. In terms of mining, and I don't have the exact figure quoted in the budget, but the figure was quoted as 500 hectares. Those areas are largely within aspects that I understand to be areas that are under active mining. We do have on an annual basis, the total area cleared for mining be around 8,000 hectares. So even though this is part of that, it remains low. Whether there could be improvements, absolutely. And I think this is where a lot of what Aiesha spoke to, looking at mercury in terms of the mining sector, looking at improving recovery in terms of technology applications, looking at mineral mapping. We've seen statistics quoted from the private sector that 1 of every 3 incursions within a mining operator, only 1 of them result in successful mineral deposit find. And that means that the other 2 incursions would lead to would be an unsuccessful attempt. So those are the kinds of things, to what Aiesha spoke to, are outlined preemptively in the LCDS to address and to minimize and to mitigate against impacts that will come from the mining sector and its removal of trees as part of its operation. So those were the 2 points I would like to raise. On the forest sector, it's clear cut in terms of the guidelines that outline how things are to happen in terms of planning as well as harvesting. And from the mining sector, where there could be improvements, I think a lot of that hopefully could see some gains as we advance LCDS 2030 implementation. In terms of poverty, we've outlined aspects within LCDS to foster micro and small enterprise development, education, health, lowering the cost of energy so as to improve and increase competitiveness, expanding hinterland infrastructure to allow for market access from hinterland areas to markets within Georgetown and even export markets. So each of those would impact on creating the opportunities that would be necessary for expanding livelihoods and for, in doing so, to be able to address those poverty goals that we set in terms of reductions. So those are just starter answers to those larger, more complex issues, but hopefully part of ongoing discussions we can have in the future as well.
Thank you so much, Pradeepa. We will move on to...
Might I have a quick response to that?
Okay, quick.
Yeah. So, not to contradict anything that Pradeepa said, but I thought that the question asked by Zelini was a really important one. And on the one hand, we can do an accounting and we can tally up things and say there will be not much done to damage our forest cover. On the other hand, we could say that incomes will be rising and that rising incomes can be an important determinant of what we actually see as the fundamental drivers of something like deforestation. I think that at issue here, when I asked the question or when I made the comment that government is playing a large role in many of these things, and then Zelini pointed out the size of the budget and the implications of that, that we have to recognize that market participants will, in the first instance, outwit government. In the second instance, there is the fundamentals. And while we might do our accounting, we might be really surprised that things happen that we never catered for. I mean, this is the story of economic policy and of the outcomes that we see. So I would say that I'm a little less confident, Pradeepa, than you are, that the adding up of things will actually be the outcomes that we will see, and that the dominance of government will be creating incentives and signals, perhaps more importantly, that might actually be more important determinants of outcomes, things that we haven't already considered. Because remember, it's not just government and what government is doing, but they're the market participants, some of whom have yet to come on the scene. So I think this question about policy and the way it works is actually a very important one. One final thing, that in the last budget, I hear, this is not to complain and to make make an issue of it, but in response to the question about inflation, I noticed that the response has been, the largest spending would be the capital budget. When we twist it or turn it, there will be an increase and a significant increase in spending in what we call aggregate demand. And to say that it's on the capital side is just suggesting and hoping that there'll be an increase in aggregate supply as yet. But that might not be guaranteed. So the way things work out, at least in economics, is not necessarily the way we think they might add up if we do our arithmetic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Singh. Mr. Collins?
Good evening, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, sir.
Wonderful. I'm going to try and make it as brief as possible. My concerns have been reflected in some of the responses I got. Maybe I should start from where Dr. Singh responded and Ms. Bholanath, because Ms. Bholanath gave me partly the kind of drift I'm concerned about, figures. And excuse me, the concern is that in these presentations, the presentations are usually very rich in abstract nouns with very few figures. For example, the first presentation showed us very clearly, gave us some figures when we saw what was the state of Guyana's deforestation with regard to the world average, and we could see that was very low. But we didn't have that, we didn't get that same kind of approach with a lot of them, with a lot of the other slides. And so my concern with these plans is that we need to see specifics in plans so that we can, in a few years' time, see what those plans were worth, and that we are not getting the sense that we are looking at several movies, different movies. We must have a sense of sequel. For example, we had years ago, I don't know how many people are old enough to remember that, but Major General Joe Singh reporting to the nation that the Convoluc River was dying. Now, in these plans, it would be good for those of us who can remember that to know, well, what is the residual effect of that? What happened to the communities in that area? How does that phenomenon fit into these plans? Is it recognized anywhere? Which brings us to the general concern about specific geographical areas in terms of these plans. So it is good to know, as Ms. Bholanath expressed just now, that yes, the concern over so-and-so is, it doesn't really turn out to be much because of this percentage of that. But that would be so nice to see specifics in terms of the overall plans, and also in terms of how that translates on the ground with regard to crisis areas that have been identified in the past, so that we can measure it. And finally, in 2013, there was a conference from an organization called ACTO. I think that was the acronym, Organization for Amazon Cooperation Treaty. Yes, that was it. So that, I believe, is an organization that monitors deforestation. I haven't heard about that for a long time, and this gives me the problem I'm talking about, a sense that we're looking at several movies instead of a sequel. So those are my concerns and my question. Thank you.
Alexi, if I can just give some quick feedback on Mr. Collins' comments. So I know the project that he's referring to, Mr. Collins is referring to, the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization ran a huge interregional inter-country project across several Amazonian forested states back in 2013 to 2016, where they mapped the deforestation drivers and forest cover over these areas. And I think it was important, and to Aisha's point in her presentation, to look at those cross-boundary effects. You know, sometimes we think of Guyana alone and what prevails within our country in terms of the drivers. But many of those drivers oftentimes were driven by drivers in other countries. And then you have, you know, this spillover effect within the borders of Guyana. So that is one of the things I think that could be contemplated a bit deeper as we finalize LCDS. This is also a point that was raised in one of our previous consultations, that whilst we look at what prevails within our boundaries and our border, you know, the sectors that are being advanced and the positive impacts that those might lead to, we shouldn't shut our eyes to what could be, you know, impacts that we have to mitigate against, again, in terms of other aspects like what the ACTO project pointed to, these cross-boundary impacts. And, you know, it could cover everything from migration to, you know, the gold mining sector, to looking at impacts in terms of fresh water, waterways, biodiversity, wetlands. The list could be very, very long. So I think that is really food for thought for us. And I like that the point has been raised a second time for our attention, given the comment we received in one of our previous sessions, as I mentioned. In terms of specific plans, so that is spot on. That is what we need. So like the LCDS is a strategy. The strategy, for it to be able to have teeth, must be accompanied by a plan that outlines what needs to be done, when it will be done by, what are the main indicators of success for each of these, and where the sources of funding will come from. So the investment plan will be the vehicle to take this forward. So it's going to answer all of the questions, hopefully, at least the relevant and pertinent questions, that if we outline that forest, let's take another one, because I know I've been speaking on forestry perhaps a bit too much. Let's say on watershed management and what needs to be done there. Aisha spoke to water governance, water for energy, water for agriculture, wastewater as well. All of that, it's great to say them, and like I have that nice list of about 10 bullet points outlining what needs to be done for water. But the relevant question that very well could be asked to me is what needs to be done to make those possible? What needs to be done at the municipal level? What needs to be done at the regional level? What needs to be done at the national level? How much will that cost? Where will the funds come from? And what will be the measures of success to know you've achieved what you set out to achieve? And that, the place for that, at least how we're treating with it, isn't in the LCDS, but it's in the accompanying investment plan that will come out as we finalize the LCDS. So that has been our approach to give an implementation focus to the strategy of LCDS 2030. And that is how we've been pursuing it as of this time.
Thank you, Pradeepa. Do we have, or can we have closing remarks from the other panelists at this point in time?
Sure, thanks a lot. Alexi, thanks, colleague, panelists, I think for a very rich discussion. I would just close off with a couple of points. And I think it probably takes off from the point that Pradeepa made in closing. I think what we have to recognize as Guyanese overall is that the realization of all of the objectives expressed within the LCDS will take active management and deliberate actions if we are to yield the results. It's not going to happen by accident, whether it's the forest carbon program, the transformation of energy and so on, of the energy grid and so on. It's not going to happen by accident. And I think just to reiterate the point I made in the presentation, that in pursuing all of these objectives that are laid out in the LCDS, we need to look at them alongside each other. So as we talk about increase in energy demand, what is driving that demand? How does that impact biodiversity in forests and other areas, so that we can, in an integrated way, drive and ensure that the development that we are pursuing really results in, as I put it again at the beginning of my presentation, really results in the increase in the total wealth, which in my opinion is really what guarantees the base for our generation as well as future generations to be able to thrive in our lovely land. So that's where I'd like to close. And again, thanks to everyone for the opportunity, and thanks for staying on this loop.
Thanks, Curtis. Aisha?
Thank you. I'm really honored again to be part of this panel and to be part of this discussion. I think having forum like these really helps to socialize different ideas, even from the onset and defining of strategies and so on, having these discussions and actually actioning these discussions into plans and implementation and so on is really what is necessary to realize things that are included in the LCDS and suggestions that are coming out here. So it is really good to be a part of this and to hear so many different comments, even if some of them are different from any of us on what our thoughts are. Even though I focused on three broad areas, I think some of the points that I would have raised in the presentation really speaks to a lot within the LCDS, ensuring that there's broad participation, ensuring that there's focus on the intrinsic value of nature and the ecological value of nature, ensuring there's policy, and so many other things. I think it can be applied in all the different areas, and so I look forward to seeing the finalization of the LCDS and including some of these comments that were made here and other consultations, and more so, as Curtis said and Pradeepa said, in the next stage in making concrete plans, making what the reality is on the ground, and ensuring that those are really addressed in all sectors, and ensuring that all participants are around the table, positive or negative, all should be included to make sure that we do succeed, because it's our country's development depends on it, and more so people's livelihoods and lives now and in the future depends on it. Thank you. Thank you to Moray House.
Thanks, Aisha. I wish to give a special thank you to all members of the panel for your rich contribution towards a dynamic discussion on the panel today. Special thanks to Pradeepa, Bholanath, to Curtis Bernard, to Aisha Williams, and in absentia, Dr. Thomas Singh, he had to leave. To the audience, thank you for joining us and for contributing towards an animated discussion. And like Curtis said, I would encourage you all to read and comment on the draft LCDS 2030 document. That's the only way that we can get our 2 cents in there, because we are all involved. And whether we wish to comment now or we wish to comment later, we will all be impacted. So you have this opportunity now, so take it. I now wish to hand you over back to Isabel. Thank you, friends. So over to Isabel.
Thank you very much, Florence, Alexi, for guiding us through the proceedings with such calm and charm. Really, it's been lovely to have a fresh voice and a fresh approach. And I think the rest of the panel would join me in thanking you for that. Warm thanks to the panel, particular thanks to the representatives. I know one was sort of leading, Pradeepa, but we also had Vanessa Ben in the audience as backup. And particular thanks to them for joining us. This is something of a rarity for Moray House Trust to have the benefit of a representative from a public organization on the panel. And I hope that it has shown that this has some benefit, and that if the discourse is not to be lopsided, we do require some sort of involvement from the powers that be, whoever they are. We've been here 10 years, we've been doing this a long time. The powers that be have changed in that time, but the approach sadly has not. I sincerely hope this marks a new departure, and I look forward to many other interactions with your colleagues and with you. Warm thanks to Curtis and Aiesha for providing different perspectives, and also to Thomas for the economist's perspective. I have to say, as an outsider, what was striking was that the pattern that seemed to be emerging from the chat and the presentations is that there is this dichotomy, there is this Jekyll and Hyde quality to the strategy, and more broadly than that, to our approach at the moment. And in the UK, there's been an attitude recently about what is it, having your cake and eating it? We can't do both. So we do need to, at some point, find a way of marrying these approaches. It also struck me that when we were talking about costs, we were talking about costing our assets. Now, as a country that's engaged in sort of several hundred years of largely extractive industries, we also need to be costing that degradation and really putting that up to the fore. So if we're going to carry on with gold mining and these other things, presumably that needs to be on the table, is the regeneration of those areas and so on. There has been a request for slides to be shared. If the panel are willing and provide them, Moray House Trust, if you just email, we will happily send them on to whoever would like them. So that's to respond to the questions in the chat. And finally, to say, agree with Curtis and the others who said, this is an opportunity for the population, to the citizenry, to respond. So please take it and do so. Thank you again, panel. We have gone on a lot longer than normal this evening, but I think that's an indication of the complexity of the topic and how much there is to be said on it. So thank you again, everyone. Have a pleasant evening, and we look forward to seeing you the next time.